Deadly hello, if you're still alive, please click on the red subscribe button below the video. Gloomy viewing.
Every small town has its local legends. They rarely go beyond the town's borders, and definitely never appear on the internet. Ironically, considering I'm writing about it now, but the locals know them by heart. I've heard many such stories during my time as a long-haul trucker, but none of them held any truth. Except for one, the story of Ghoul. I heard it while traveling through South Dakota. I stopped for the night because I was too tired and the windshield was fogging up so badly. I ended up in a tiny town called Abaraz, about an hour from Custer and 3 hours from where I needed to deliver my cargo. When I say tiny, I really mean tiny. There were about 15 buildings in total, most of which were residential. The rest consisted of a diner with a bar, a church, and a gas station. The town was quiet and remote, as if lost in time. The roads were empty, and I felt like the only person for miles around. The walls of the bar, where I decided to stop, were adorned with photos of locals, old posters, and newspaper clippings that told of the town's former glory days. There were only a few patrons in the bar that evening, all of whom seemed to be regulars. I sat at the bar and ordered myself a cup of coffee to perk me up. The bartender, an elderly man with a gray beard, poured me a cup and asked where I was from. After a brief conversation about the road and the cargo, I mentioned that I had heard a few local legends while traveling through towns like this. This piqued the bartender's interest, and he leaned in closer. "Have you ever heard the story of Ghoul?" he asked mysteriously. The patrons sitting nearby fell silent, clearly knowing what he was referring to. I shook my head, intrigued. The bartender continued, "It's a story that has been passed down from generation to generation. And believe me, this story has more truth to it than you can imagine." I could feel the tension in the bar, and I knew I was in for a story that would make me rethink my attitude towards local legends. I didn't have much faith in the quality of the food in this diner, but I was starving, so I decided I'd at least sit at the bar and order a couple of greasy sandwiches if they had them. The bell jingled as I walked in, and I was met by an almost empty dining room. Right away, I noticed 3 people in the building. There was the bartender, a bald man with a beard, who immediately gave me a curious look. The only other person at the bar was a young woman drinking a beer with no label who didn't even turn around when I sat down. I was clearly an outsider. I could feel that I wasn't exactly welcome here, but I decided not to let it bother me. I grabbed the menu and chose a beer I wanted. As I took my first sip, the woman finally spoke. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Her voice was both rough and soothing. I was a little surprised, but proud of my ability to be polite, so I turned to her and tried to make small talk. "I'm not from around here, just passing through," I figured. "What brought you this way?" "Starving, that's what. I've been on the road for 11 hours. She laughed. She was attractive, but not really my type, so I hoped she wouldn't take my joking comments as flirting. "You're funny." I turned away for a moment to signal for another beer, then turned back to her. "I have my moments." She glanced at the bartender as he brought me my second beer and waited until he took my order before signaling to him. "Rico, shall we?" He just grunted something in reply and headed for the kitchen. She seemed to take this as confirmation and looked at me expectantly. "You really should try this," she said with a glint in her eye. I sensed that this was an invitation to try something special, and I was curious to see what they had in mind. From the moment Rico returned from the kitchen with something in his hands, I realized that this evening might not be as I expected. All 3 of us felt a certain tension, as if something unspoken was brewing in the air. I waited with anticipation to see what would happen next. We have a tradition here. Everyone who drinks at the bar has to tell a story. It doesn't have to be anything too amazing, but there are only 23 of us here, so we always want to hear something new. I'm not much of a storyteller, to be honest. You might think I'd have some exciting stories after traveling around the country, but I rarely left the road for more than a few days, so I didn't have many events worth mentioning. Nevertheless, I decided to put on a good show and tell them a story about the first time I saw the ocean. As I ate my onion rings, I tried to make the story as exciting as possible, and, I must admit, exaggerated the details a bit. I'd never actually seen killer whales, but they didn't need to know that. I described how I felt when I first stepped onto the beach, how I felt the vastness and power of the sea, how huge waves crashed against the shore. I tried to convey all the emotions and impressions I had experienced and used a lot of vivid details to make the story come alive. She looked at the bartender when he brought me my second beer and waited until he took my order before signaling to him. "Rico, shall we?" He just grunted something in reply and headed for the kitchen. She seemed to take this as confirmation and looked at me expectantly. "You really should try this," she said with a glint in her eye. I sensed that this was an invitation to try something special, and I was curious to see what they had in mind. From the moment Rico returned from the kitchen with something in his hands, I realized that this evening might not be as I expected. All three of us felt a certain tension, as if something unspoken was brewing in the air. I waited with anticipation to see what would happen next. We have a tradition here. Everyone who drinks at the bar has to tell a story. It doesn't have to be anything too amazing, but there are only 23 of us here, so we always want to hear something new. I'm not much of a storyteller, to be honest. You might think I'd have some exciting stories after traveling around the country, but I rarely left the road for more than a few days, so I didn't almost have many events worth mentioning. Nevertheless, I decided to put on a good show and tell them a story about the first time I saw the ocean. As I ate my onion rings, I tried to make the story as exciting as possible, and, I must admit, exaggerated the details a bit. I'd never actually seen killer whales, but they didn't need to know that. I described how I felt when I first stepped onto the beach, how I felt the vastness and power of the sea, how huge waves crashed against the shore. I tried to convey all the emotions and impressions I had experienced, and used a lot of vivid details to make the story come alive. She seemed captivated by the story. She sat, her chin resting on her hands, and her bright eyes were fixed on me. Her attention was so captivated that I felt my words coming alive for her, and it gave me even more inspiration. I noticed that even Rico, when he returned from the kitchen and stood behind the bar again, was listening with interest, although with a slight smile on his face. With each new detail of my story, the atmosphere in the bar became warmer. I felt that the story had really touched the listeners, and it was a pleasant contrast to the feeling of alienation I had initially felt. I finished my story, hoping that it had left a good impression. "That's all," I said, smiling at them. The woman looked satisfied, and her smile widened as she thanked me for the interesting story. I felt a little lighter in this small community, where I seemed to have finally found my place, at least for this evening. It seemed that this tradition, though simple, and I was glad that I was able to be a part of this small ritual in such a remote town. I finished my story and returned to the bar, leaving a 20 on the counter as a tip. I was already ready to say goodbye when the woman stopped me, a slight smile appearing on her face. "You have a good voice for storytelling. Thank you for telling us your story. I want to tell you one too." I was very tired, but manners prevented me from refusing, so I smiled and nodded, inviting her to continue. "I tell this story to everyone who comes in here because it stays with you for a long time." I almost jumped out of my chair when the bartender finally spoke. Although his words were not addressed to me, they stunned me. "Ghoul again?" he asked, smiling slightly. "Yes," she confirmed, "unless you have a better idea." The bartender was silent, and the woman turned back to me, beginning her story. I've known this story since I was a child, she began. It's been told in our town for many years. Maybe you've already heard it from Rico, but it's one of those stories that intertwines with legends and reality, and it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. She paused, as if trying to find the right words. In Abaraz, there's a place that the locals call the graveyard. Without names, it's an abandoned area outside of town, covered in old trees and overgrown vegetation. There used to be a real cemetery there, but over time people stopped using it, and it gradually turned into a place that scares the locals. I felt a chill run down my spine. The woman continued. They say that Ghoul wanders there at night. He was one of the first inhabitants of the town, disappeared without a trace over 100 years ago. Legend has it that he was condemned to eternal wandering for a terrible crime that he didn't have time to atone for. Those who try to go to this place after sunset say they feel a cold wind, hear strange noises, and even see his silhouette in the darkness. Her voice became quieter and more tense. Many people who come here talk about the feeling of being watched from the darkness, and that they see a glint in the eyes that disappears when they are noticed. Nobody knows why Ghoul chooses this particular place for his wanderings, but he remains here, guarding some secret. Sometimes, they say, he even leaves marks on the graves that no one can explain. Many have tried to find Ghoul or unravel his mystery, but nothing has ever been successful. All these attempts ended in nothing, and as a rule, those who visited there never returned without strange emotions. So be careful if you decide to visit this place. Legend has its power, and sometimes it can turn into something more than just a story. When she finished her story, I felt that it had become even quieter in the bar. I looked at Rico, who was giving me a small glance, and realized that this place and its stories really had more than just local rumors. I was intrigued and a little scared, wondering if I should check out this legend myself. Ghoul is a local story about something that haunts people who pass through the town. It's a tall, pale figure who only speaks one word at a time. It starts stalking someone as soon as they hear its story and doesn't stop until it takes their life. I sat there, relatively relaxed, listening as she described the ways the ghost makes people disappear. But obviously, I didn't take it seriously. But do you want to know how to tell for sure that Ghoul is already after you? She asked. How? I asked. He makes you see things, man. Things that aren't really there. He'll make you see them, and you'll feel like it's real. For me, this story sounded like a bad drug trip or like an excuse to keep me in town. I squinted, trying to stay alert, when she finally finished her story and decided it was time to go back to the motel before she decided to continue her story. Well, I'm off for the night. Have a good evening, all of you. Her smile vanished, and she simply stared at me with an empty gaze. I got up and walked towards the door, kicking it open. Hey, one question before you go. I sighed and turned around. I just wanted to go to sleep. Yeah, what is it? You can see me, right? She asked. I wasn't sure if I heard correctly, but the question did seem strange. Who is we? Her and the bartender? Of course, I can see them. They're right here. She was starting to scare me a little. Yeah, I replied, hoping it was just a weird question. She took a sip of her drink and looked at the bartender before turning back to me. Well, good night. Her words were simple and coldly formal, and her gaze remained neutral. I left the bar, trying not to think about her strange behavior, and headed towards the motel. After this unexpected night in a small town, I was ready to finally get some rest, even if there were still some disturbing thoughts about this Ghoul story. My brow furrowed, and I stepped out the door. Whatever was wrong with that woman, I didn't want anything to do with it. She had been quite friendly up until this point, and I didn't understand where these sudden, strange questions and threats came from. I wasn't in the mood to think about it, so I started walking down the street towards the motel. As I walked, I thought about the story she'd told. Why was this particular story chosen for those passing through the town? Maybe it was a way to scare people into staying. I wasn't sure. I reached the motel, opened the door to my room, and went inside. Thinking about the whole situation again, I brushed my teeth and got into bed. Fatigue was strong, and I wanted to forget everything that had happened that evening. But as I lay in bed, trying to relax, the woman's story wouldn't leave my head. I kept replaying the words of Ghoul and his strange properties over and over in my head. It was some kind of distortion of reality that made people see things that weren't there. I tried to dismiss it all as fiction, but a part of me still felt a certain tension. Eventually, I fell asleep, trying to shut off all these disturbing thoughts. But even in my dreams, images from the story of Ghoul often surfaced, and I would wake up feeling an unpleasant chill in the room. And although I tried to convince myself that it was all just fiction, a part of my consciousness couldn't get rid of the thought that there might be something more to it than just a story. I woke up to a knock at the door. I rubbed my eyes and groaned. I didn't feel rested at all. I turned over and grabbed my phone from the nightstand, squinting as the bright light of the screen hit my eyes. It was 3:00 AM. I had no idea what anyone could need at this hour, but I wasn't ready to deal with it. I put the phone back down and closed my eyes, hoping that whoever was knocking would go away. The knocking continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. I lay in bed, listening to the silence and trying to calm down so I could fall back asleep. But my relaxation didn't last long. Thoughts about that strange woman and her story were still swirling in my head. I tried not to think about it, but the anxious feelings persisted. After a few minutes of unsuccessful attempts to fall back asleep, I heard a knock at the door again. This time it was a little louder and more rhythmic. I sighed, decided to get up and see what was going on. Maybe it was just an awkward worker or some kind of false alarm. I put on my robe and went to the door. When I opened the door, there was no one on my doorstep. I looked left and right, but everything was quiet and dark. Maybe it was just a dream, or maybe someone was playing a prank. I closed the door and went back to bed, deciding that it was better to try to fall asleep again than to think about it. For the second time in bed, I heard a faint noise, as if someone was quietly passing by my window. I listened, but the sound died down again. Maybe it was just the wind or cars outside. I tried to turn off my thoughts and closed my eyes again, trying to push away these unpleasant feelings. A second knock woke me up completely. It was much louder than the previous one, as if someone had hit the door hard with their palm. I jumped out of bed and fell to the floor, hoping they wouldn't try to open the door. I had to get to the door and press myself against it. I wasn't sure if the old motel door would hold. I crawled on my hands and knees to the other side of the room, and when my bare back pressed against the cold, scratched wood, the knock suddenly stopped. I was terrified at the thought that I would hear the handle turn or feel the door give way after a blow, but none of that happened. Instead, I heard rustling sounds from behind the door, which turned into a single word that broke the silence. Open. It was no louder than a whisper, but in the deafening silence, I heard it clearly. My heart sank, and I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. It definitely didn't sound like someone I knew, but it also didn't sound like either a male or a female voice. I tried not to move and held my breath. Please, open. The words sounded again, and this time they were spoken by the same indistinct voice. I remained motionless on the floor, feeling every beat of my heart echo in the silence. I tried to figure out what to do next, but fear paralyzed me. I thought that maybe it was just someone playing a prank or trying to scare me. But why was this person so persistent? I continued to lie on the floor, watching the door and listening for any sounds that might indicate that someone was trying to get in. I could feel the air change slightly in the room, but no sound indicated that anyone was trying to break in. Only the same rustling sounds, and again, the quiet whisper, "Open." I was afraid to even move, because every sound could indicate that something was about to happen. I thought about the fact that if this was real danger, it might be too late to do anything. I wondered if I should try to contact someone or find another way to resolve the situation. But at that moment, I felt only anxiety and fear that wouldn't let me calm down. Every quiet word on the door hammered on my nerves, pumping adrenaline into my system. Whoever was out there behind the door either really needed help or was trying to get me on edge, so I would open the door and fall into a trap, not knowing what awaited me. I had to stay in place if I went for the phone. I was afraid the door would suddenly open and I would find myself face to face with whoever was behind it. My head was buzzing from fear, and I tried to breathe as quietly as possible, watching the door. I thought about possible courses of action. I could try to contact someone, but wasn't it too late? Wouldn't it be better to just stay still and watch? I decided that it was best to stay where I was and not reveal myself. It was the least dangerous option until I learned more about what was going on. The door remained motionless, and I only heard distant sounds beyond it. I tried to understand if there was any pattern to the rustling and whispering. Maybe it was just my imagination or a figment of my imagination. But why did the voice repeat the same word? It had to be something more. I made an attempt to get to my feet, but only raised my head when I suddenly heard a new sound, a quiet but persistent tugging, as if someone was trying to open the door. My heart pounded even faster, and I realized that this moment had become critical. I felt my fear reach its peak, and I decided that the best option would be to monitor the situation from the side and wait for further actions. My breathing was heavy and irregular, and my head was still spinning with questions. Was there someone behind the door who really needed help? Or was it just another trick from whoever was trying to scare me? I sat there, it seemed, for an eternity. When I started to fall asleep again, much to my disappointment, I heard footsteps moving away from the door. I gradually moved away from the door until the footsteps became quieter, and I was almost at the nightstand when I looked up. The bathroom door, which was open when I went to bed, was now closed. I froze, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, knocks started from the other side of the bathroom door. I jumped up instantly, grabbed my phone and keys, and rushed to the room door. As I opened the door, I heard heavy footsteps not far behind me, as well as a familiar voice. "No." The voice repeated calmly, following me. I rushed down the stairs, running across the parking lot to my truck. As I jumped into the driver's seat, I felt something hit the door. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but I did. My heart pounded faster when I turned my head and saw that the door to the truck, which I had left closed, was now slightly ajar. Something or someone was standing by the door, and I felt panic rising. I grabbed the keys, turned them in the ignition, and started the engine. As I drove out of the parking lot, I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping not to see any threat behind me. The streets were dark and empty, and I was grateful that no strange sound or vision disturbed this silence. I continued driving until my heart calmed down and my mind began to return to normal. I was overcome with fatigue and tension, and I tried to figure out what exactly had happened and what could have been the thing that followed me. As soon as I drove away from the motel, I only heard the engine noise and rhythmic breathing. I drove on, trying not to think about what I had left behind. But one thing was clear: what happened that night would leave a mark on me for a long time. Outside, my door was a distorted face. The eyes were the size of baseballs and were wide open, fixed directly on me. The mouth remained open, as if the jaws could not close. There was no nose, ears, or any other features on the face. We stared at each other, probably for several seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Without moving its gaping mouth, it said, "See, me." A feeling of anxiety and fear overwhelmed me, and I couldn't take my eyes off this horrifying vision. I remained motionless, trying to understand what was happening. My heart was pounding so fast that it seemed like it was about to burst. My head was spinning from the tension, and I couldn't understand how to react to what was standing in front of me. Just as I began to feel that fear was completely paralyzing my movements, the distorted face seemed to begin to disappear. I felt my legs gradually return me to reality. I took a deep breath and began to carefully step back, not taking my eyes off the terrifying sight. As soon as I took a few steps back, the face disappeared into the darkness of the night, as if it was just an illusion. When I returned to my truck, I felt cold sweat cover my body again. I quickly got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and started the engine. My hands were shaking, and I was stunned by what I had just seen. I looked in the rearview mirror again, hoping not to see any sign of the presence of this terrible creature. The night was quiet, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. I drove on into the darkness, trying to calm down and figure out what I had just experienced. But the thought that I had left behind a distorted face would not leave me. At this point, I already understood what was happening, and I jammed the keys into the ignition. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't breathe until the town disappeared into the distance, leaving only a faint light. I was exhausted and could barely keep my eyes open. I yawned and slapped myself in the face, trying to wake myself up, but I could feel myself dozing off. Yet I felt something else, a sense of fear that sat deep in my stomach. Wiping the sweat from my forehead, I realized that I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Raising my head, I carefully turned it to the left, keeping my eyes on the road. I needed to be sure nothing was following me. The shadows of the trees cast long, ominous silhouettes on the asphalt, and every movement seemed to me part of some terrible scenario. I spent a few minutes watching the darkness outside the window, and I felt anxiety gripping me again. I listened for any sounds that might indicate something was wrong. But, fortunately, the night remained quiet. Nothing seemed as scary as what I had seen at the motel. As I drove, I tried to gather my thoughts. I was tormented by the question, was it just an illusion, or was what I saw real? Could I have missed something? Something that could help explain this terrible vision? As soon as I turned my head back to the road, I noticed how the landscape around me was changing from darkness to some light in the distance. I realized that I needed to find a place where I could rest and think about everything that had happened. The feeling of fear hadn't left me yet, and I knew that until I could explain it, I wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. I continued to move forward, trying not to think about what I had left behind. The night was long and dark, but I hoped that, finally, I would find some peace and be able to sort out what had happened that night. It was still there. Its head was now directly in the center of my window, smiling at me. I suppressed the urge to scream and turned my gaze back to the road. It couldn't get inside, and it couldn't hurt me if I didn't look at it. But what it could do was talk. In its low, creepy voice, punctuated by a hoarse growl. "You, see, me." I felt my nerves stretching to the limit, and I tried to concentrate on the road. The choice between not looking at that horrific face and continuing to move was a real struggle. The voice that sounded was so horrible and full of malice that it was hard to ignore. In the darkness of the night, every sound seemed to amplify and intensify the fear. I tried to rationally plan my actions, knowing that I needed to stay calm and focused. Otherwise, I could get into an accident or be so distracted that I would be in danger. I wondered if I could avoid what these visions were imposing on me, if I just ignored them. As I drove, I noticed how the darkness around me was beginning to be disturbed by the faint light from distant lights. I tried to keep my hand on the steering wheel firmly, and breathe evenly, realizing that I needed to find a place where I could stop and restore my strength. However, the voice behind the window continued to repeat the same thing, as if it were some kind of evil ritual that never ends. I couldn't help but notice how its words were becoming more and more obsessive and penetrating my consciousness. As soon as I saw a sign indicating a stop in the nearest town, I realized that I needed to stop and try to figure out the situation. I couldn't continue driving like that, with the constant fear that something was following me. I slowly reduced my speed and turned towards the nearest motel, hoping that there I could find some respite from this horror. It repeated for hours. I almost forgot what silence was like until the sun began to rise. As soon as morning began and light filled my eyes again, everything fell silent, and only the sound of my tires sliding on the uneven road remained. I looked to the left and saw trees through the window. Nothing was obstructing the view anymore. My heart was still beating fast, but the feeling of fear began to subside. I tried to take a deep breath, trying to calm down and figure out what had happened. The light of the morning brought some peace, and I tried to focus on reality, not on those terrifying visions that had haunted me all night. The ordeal of the night left me exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stop. I was still far from home and felt I needed to reach safety before I could figure out what had happened. I turned my attention to the road, which looked peaceful in the morning light, and realized that my mind was beginning to clear again. As soon as I drove past a few kilometers from that horrible place I had left behind, I felt my anxiety start to dissipate. Maybe it was just a terrifying vision caused by excessive fatigue or stress. But that couldn't explain what I saw and why it affected me so much. I decided to stop in the nearest town to rest and calm down. I knew I had to find a place where I could safely stop and think about my next steps. As soon as I found a small hotel, I stopped and, taking a few minutes to restore my strength, tried to figure out how to move on. I arrived in Dupree shortly after that and didn't even help the workers at the factory unload the cargo. I just sat in the driver's seat, smoked a cigarette, and thought about what had happened. When someone knocked on the window, I almost had a heart attack. It was the factory manager, whom I had called to sign the documents for the goods. "Everything okay? A couple of my guys said you didn't look very good." I cleared my throat and extinguished the cigarette in the ashtray. I looked at him and tried to smile. "Yeah, everything's fine. Long night, practically didn't sleep. Left the place at 3 a.m. 3:00 a.m. How far were you that you only arrived now?" I tried to explain the situation, realizing that the story I could tell would sound too strange. "Must have been delayed on the road. Various unforeseen circumstances. You know how it is." The factory manager nodded, but I could see that he still looked interested. I tried not to focus his attention on my condition and quickly finished with all the necessary formalities. When all the documents were signed, I felt that I could finally relax a little. I left the factory, eager to find some corner of peace. The feeling of fear and anxiety still hadn't left me, and I knew I needed to find a way to cope with it. I decided to find a small cafe or restaurant where I could have a coffee and try to gather my thoughts again. As I drove through the town, I couldn't help but notice how strange everything seemed. Every shadow and every noise looked suspicious. I tried not to pay attention to my fears, realizing that they were probably just the result of stress and fatigue. But even this understanding couldn't completely dispel my anxiety. I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel pad, holding my notebook. It was nice to talk about something ordinary after everything I had been through. I was in Abarrage. Strange little town for sure. Abarrage? Never heard of it. I looked at him, expecting him to joke. His eyebrows were furrowed, and he looked concerned. I took out my phone and showed him the delivery tracking app, where it was indicated where I'd stopped for the night. "Here, He looked away from the phone and looked at me with a serious expression. I've hunted there. There's nothing there but forests for miles around. A chill ran down my spine. Anxiety washed over me. Could I really have encountered something that didn't exist? Was that nightmare real, or was it just a dream that couldn't be real? I was there all night. I can't be sure it was just my imagination, I replied, trying to remain calm. The factory manager frowned and sighed deeply. Maybe you're just tired and worn out. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when you haven't slept for a long time. He tried to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just fatigue had happened. I thanked him for his concern and continued on my way, trying to cope with these new thoughts. I returned to my truck and continued on my journey, trying to leave the terrible experience behind. But even on a calm day that had begun, I knew that what I had experienced would stay with me forever. And what really happened in Aberraj would remain a mystery that I would probably never be able to solve.